Seven.
Derek, how are
Planning.
you?
I'm great. Months of planning have gone into this, and finally, we're here, March 23rd, 2021, the beginning of hopefully what is the first of several of Orchid Private. I have to imagine, as the head of the company, you are incredibly excited about this.
Absolutely, yes. When we were talking about it, I guess like maybe even like 18 months ago, we started thinking about this, and we first thought, let's do some really cool conference in 2020, and then of course the world changed in February, and or a little bit earlier, I guess, for some people, and of course all the plans put on hold. And then about 6 months ago, we started thinking, well, everyone's doing these virtual events now. We should do one too. And I think what's interesting actually for one of our highlighted speakers, Ed Snowden, is that usually, and I've seen him a number of times at different conferences, usually we're at the conference live and he comes to us in the sort of the virtual space, the Zoom space, if you like, or the video space. Now we're all coming to him in the same space, in the virtual environment. So I think it's been definitely an adjustment over the last year, learning how to do these virtual events. And I'm really excited that we're able to bring together just an incredible set of speakers, people contributing to this conference. And as you said, I'm hoping this is not just the start of a number of events, but also increases the global awareness of the importance of privacy. And we can work together with many of the people here to really make a difference.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, the proof is in the pudding, really, with the lineup we have, not only today, but over the next few days between people like Harry Halpin, Jorge Rios, Ed Snowden, as you mentioned, even Orchid's co-founders. I mean, Jay Freeman, Brian Fox, Gustav, and yourself. You can't, you'd be hard pressed to find, uh, uh, that much pedigree around the idea of privacy and digital security all in one place. And in this case, you guys are the four co-founders of Orchid. Everybody will have some screen time over the next few days. We'll be talking with Gustav. I'll be talking with Gustav later today in order to catch up with him and talk about what he's been up to and what he finds important. But the panels and the talks that are coming over the next few days really speak for themselves. It's an incredibly important time in this fight for privacy and digital security, and I think this is a really great way to highlight that starting today.
Exactly. I think also the last year has really, kind of when we started the company, I guess like 3.5 years ago, in talking to people back then, there was still a question in people's mind: is like, is this digital privacy thing important? Everyone just jumps into Snapchat, and who cares? It's just convenience over privacy. Like, people just choose convenience. And I think especially what we've seen in the last year, everything from the ideas around digital contact tracing to what's happened in Israel, people the government's tracking you with cell phone information, the censorship even from the beginning of the pandemic in China, where information about the origins of the virus was lacking for many months, and actually the doctor who originally surfaced that in WeChat channels then was detained and unfortunately died from COVID himself. So I think just this awareness of not just privacy but also censorship and the importance of really being able to enable people to access information and communicate privately is increasing in the world. When you turn to just sort of the developments in the space, the decentralized space, and I think there's a lot of very interesting projects and very interesting developments that are coming together now. And I'm really hoping that we're starting to get to a point, if we are not there already, where with sort of the collection of Web3 decentralized technologies, we can build a different kind of internet, one where privacy is built in by default, rather than something that you kind of add on later, because adding things on later tends not to be something that people opt into all the time.
Yeah, and maybe that's a good time to remind people that Orchid has a podcast called Follow the White Rabbit. Alex Kahaya, one of Orchid's team members, has been highlighting the founders and the thinkers behind a lot of these Web 3.0 decentralized projects. I believe somebody from Fala was on recently. We did an AMA with them last year as well. And of course, Brian was on talking about his open source voting project that he's assisted with. So, there's a lot of ways to highlight this. Follow the White Rabbit is one of them. So if you haven't listened to that yet, please go subscribe. And in the meantime, we're just about to pass things off here to our first panel. Let's do that now. We've got Adriana Hemaker and the panel for Build Your Own Internet. Really looking forward to it.
Thanks, Eric. Thanks, everybody.
So I'm thrilled to be here, and thanks to Orchid, because we're debating such a key subject. 29 countries experienced internet shutdowns last year, according to a report published by Access Now. And I'm here to debate that and what we can do about it with, first of all, Vinay Gupta, founder of London-based fintech Mattereum, which is using smart contracts to sell and lease physical property and other legal rights. And he also invented Hexayear, a disaster relief tent. Vinay's focused on how technologies can impact decision makers and has advised the Pentagon on disaster relief. He's also versed in energy policy, defense, security, and all manner of other subjects. Then Harry Halpin is a visiting researcher at INRIA de Paris, where he leads the Next Leap project, and he's a research scientist at the Socio-Technical Systems Research Center at MIT on blockchain technology. He's a web philosopher and an open internet advocate, and the CEO of privacy tech startup NIM, which is focused on mixed nets, which is a way to jumble and randomly reroute internet connections through proxy servers or nodes. And then finally, Jorge Rios, who is the founder of Bridgefy, and Bridgefy's technology helps millions of people use mobile apps without an internet connection through Bluetooth-based mesh networks for mobile. He's a serial entrepreneur. He founded Bridgefy out of a need he saw that Mexico City inhabitants had to be able to communicate after earthquakes, and he's received multiple awards, including one from the UN. So I'll go first to Jorge, and we want to get an idea of the problem here, because at the moment, there is one particular country that's experiencing severe outages. Do you want to tell us about that?
Yes, hi, thank you. I'm Jorge, CEO of Bridgefy, and yes, the country you're referring to is Myanmar. And we know that since last November, there were elections, and they were contested, and the military-run party decided to do a coup d'etat in February 1st of this year, and that's in Myanmar. And that's when we realized that people started downloading one of our products, the Bridgefy messaging app, because there was an internet shutdown. They limited access to the internet to the millions and millions of people living in Myanmar, and specifically in the largest cities. And so people started downloading the Bridgefy app, which works, like you mentioned, without the internet, so they could keep communicating when they were outside on the streets protesting, and they could stay safe, and they could stay just in close communication with each other, even though they were going to be surrounded by very large crowds and without being able to access their data.
Right. And this isn't the only country where you're using the technology, right?
Correct. We have massive amounts of downloads in Nigeria, in the United States for Black Lives Matter, in Thailand, Iran, India, just a whole list of countries in which there have been either natural disasters and or internet shutdowns. And they have identified the Bridgefy technology to be able to help them during these situations.
Right. And recently as well, I've seen in the Middle East, particularly Iraq, there's a lot of shutdowns. And I know, Harry, you've spent some time in the Middle East, in Syria specifically.
Yeah, so I'm not very long, but I got interested in this question of censorship because I was in North Africa, actually in Tunisia, helping run a Twitter feed for my friends who were in Tahrir Square during the initial Arab Spring kickoff. And I did support for Syrian journalists like Basil Safadi to help them basically resist what they understood as Syrian government, the Assad government in particular, tracking when they started the revolt. And this is back in 2011, right? So in 2011, people were like, how do we use decentralized Web3 tech to prevent ourselves from being killed? We can organize protests, which at that point were mostly against police brutality in Syria. Now, what happened, I think it's very important to note, at that point, not too much work. So all these folks like Basel and other protesters, they did it using Skype, okay? And then what happened, to my understanding, that somehow the Syrian government, possibly through the Iraqi government, possibly 2 degrees from the US, it's not entirely clear, somehow backdoored or got into the Skype and essentially arrested a lot of the key organizers of the original protest movement. And I think what this reveals is that a few things. First thing is, now it's 2021. I was in Syria 2 years ago, 2019 at the fall of ISIS, and it was very clear at that point that you had a very bad situation where you had the Assad government using surveillance tech, both homegrown stuff and stuff from Russia, Turkey essentially using NATO surveillance equipment against the Kurds who were fighting ISIS. And the ability to track where people were, what cell phones and what internet connections was leading not just to house arrests and murders, like we saw in the beginning of the Syrian revolution, but to drone strikes, car bombs. And this is incredibly dangerous stuff. And when I got back to the United States this year, I said, to be honest, Syria was a really nice place in 2010 and 9. It was stable, dictatorship, but stable. And looking at the United States, I could eventually see these sort of things happen here. And the problem, I think mesh nets are amazing. Decentralization is necessary. And I'm really honored to be on this panel with Bridgefy, but it's one of the few usable mesh nets things out there. But as we can tell today, the problem is that a global adversary, someone like Assad, someone like Erdogan with NATO capabilities, someone like Putin, can watch the entire network. And even if you have your own meshnet network, if they control all the ISPs, they control the ins and outs, unless you have a satellite, and they can probably monitor that too, they can use that information to track you. So that's why I'm working on mixed nets, attempting to essentially make it harder to track these kinds of build your own internet initiatives. And I am honestly worried about the United States, but I'll hand that to Vinay, I suspect.
Right. Yes. Let's hear from Vinay. I mean, what do you think? I mean, does it call for maybe a dual layered approach, like mixed nets isn't enough, mesh nets isn't enough?
Well, so my concern here is that all of these technologies are extremely useful for insurgencies, and some of those insurgencies, like the Kurds, we might be sympathetic to, and some of those other insurgencies like Al Qaeda down in Texas, we might be less sympathetic to. So, this question of if we set up these kind of technologies, are we really ready for what comes next? I mean, in the Ethereum space, we had a right round of horror because people that were building alt-right dominated communication platforms kept threatening to run large-scale fundraising on Ethereum and then bring their technologies to Ethereum with the proceeds. And we successfully repelled that fairly consistently for several years, very fortunately. Otherwise, we might have seen something like Parler on Ethereum. And if you imagine the damage culturally and structurally that we've seen in America from Parler on Ethereum, that could very well have broken Ethereum, right? Probably not technically, possibly legally, certainly culturally. So I think we have to be very careful here about figuring out, how do we decide what we're willing to support? And in the case of technologies which are genuinely just dropped into the environment and allowed to run, what happens next? Because I think, 10 years ago, we were doing this from a nice, safe, cushioned, insulated liberalism, where it didn't seem like we would ever personally see blowback from this kind of stuff. And I think, we'll see what happens by the end of riot season in America this year, but I am not expecting it to be a particularly peaceful summer.
Wow. Okay. So, but it seems to me that these different technologies are suitable for different circumstances. So could you perhaps give me an example, one of you, of a situation where a mixed-net might be appropriate and a situation where a mesh-net might be appropriate, and where other forms of other tools that we could use?
Yeah, I can speak on mixed-net. So, I mean, to be honest, I'm more of a Bitcoin maximalist than anything else, but I recognize there's really a need for decentralized VPNs, privacy tech in general, mixed nets and mesh nets. All of these things are completely necessary. And I think mesh nets are really the only thing that can help when you have these kind of large scale internet shutoffs. I would love to hear more from Jorge about what he's seen. I know friends of mine in Hong Kong and other places really did swear by these technologies, and they weren't really working too well in 2011, and now they've matured a lot. Mixed nets are useful when your concern is not the government of Myanmar or the government of Nigeria. Your concern is an intelligence agency or large corporate player, or even chain house if you're interested in Bitcoin transactions, that can monitor the entire network of a country, a city, or just is focused on you. And so that would be, so if you're if you're Edward Snowden, you want to hide your communication, you probably need a mixed net. If you are an activist in Iran and the internet's been cut, you probably need a mesh net. And you can layer these things on top of each other, but we're still too early days, to my knowledge, getting that stuff to work in the real world.
Right. So I have to admit that when I first read about mesh nets, I mean, it didn't sound that great in terms of how far it could extend, for instance. So Jorge, could you tell me how things have improved recently?
Yes, since we began building Bridgefy 7 years ago, technologies have improved and we've improved with them. So for example, back in 2014, we could achieve a range of around 40 meters at best, 45 meters at best, but now we can achieve ranges of 100 meters between two nodes. And then as we all know, the mesh networks allow us to extend that distance for each node that is in the middle. So instead of being 100 meters, it's 100, 200, 300, 400, you get the idea. And as Bluetooth technologies and operating systems and whatnot improve, we will improve with them. So fortunately, I dare say that mesh networks are more interesting today, as we can cover an unlimited amount of devices and cover unlimited distances as well.
Right. But I mean, this problem of no internet, I mean, how does that affect these technologies? What happens if there is no internet at all? I mean, satellite systems, what's the answer there?
I guess I can take this one. So we are the mesh networks, offline mesh networks are one potential answer to that question. So basically, when you don't have access to the internet, but you already have mesh networking capabilities built into, let's say, a mobile app on your phone, like in the case of the Bridgefy app, then you don't need any connection to the internet whatsoever. We've managed to connect tens, dozens of thousands of devices at the same time without a single one having access to the internet. Some examples: Hong Kong in 2019, Nigeria 2020, more recently Myanmar. There was in the hundreds of thousands of people using it at the same time, and not one single person was using it without the internet. And we know this because the app doesn't have internet capabilities to keep everything safe. Everything lives on your phone and is decentralized. So basically, this is one solution that we've come up with. Like, it works whether you're in the middle of nowhere or whether you're in the middle of a 100,000 person crowd and nobody has access to data.
Well, I'm one of those lucky people who haven't had to put up with being in those circumstances, as probably most of the people who are listening. But I know that normal people have to put up with restrictions on their freedoms and their rights as well. And that's particularly happening because some of the big social media giants, Facebook, TikTok, they're all expanding their market share and their power over data sharing. So let's turn to Vinay. I mean, how can normal people who aren't out in the middle of a jungle or in a place where there's no internet, I mean, how can they take care to preserve their own privacy?
Well, I mean, here, the first thing that we have to hit is the word normal, right? There are no normal people.
Yeah, sure.
Right.
Someone like you and me.
Yeah, precisely, right? But when I say there are no normal people, there are no normal people, right? It doesn't matter who you are, it doesn't matter what you're doing. There's no way of knowing that in the future, something that you consider to be perfectly normal will not become highly controversial or illegal, right? Country after country after country after country has gone through these extreme right-wing political swings. And, you think that, the work you did helping organize a labor union at your office was normal, or you think your sexual orientation is normal, or you think your religion is normal. 5 years down the line, very suddenly you discover that you're in a target group. And this is the one thing that I really wish people understood, that, you kind of look around at everybody, you think you're pretty much in the middle of the herd and you're safe, you're there, and there will be no problem. And then you think back to the, German Jewish war heroes of World War I, who were completely confident that they were normal Germans. Suddenly there's a problem. So, the first thing is the mindset shift, which is in the event that either our society or our government stampedes off in some awful direction, any single one of us could be exposed for something that we consider to be completely normal now. This is absolutely bedrock. We've got 100, 150 years of really good data on this. Society is unstable, government is unstable, we can't assume safety. And then once that's clear, all of your personally identifying information, all of the information about you and your lifestyle, all of this stuff is just laying down hostages to fortune. And it doesn't matter if it's encrypted, right? If that data is stored anywhere, even encrypted, we know for sure that 10, 15, 20 years out, all of that encryption will be broken. So you have to have networks which forget, not just networks which protect. And, we need data erasure on top of cryptography. And this is where mesh becomes so useful, because mesh networks just don't store the messages. There's no room to store the messages. They can't store the messages. And this is an entirely different situation to having, the NSA's enormous fat pipe directly plugged into the internet routers, pulling down the entire traffic of a network, let's say AT&T, for analysis and possibly for storage.
I think this is something that a lot of people perhaps don't really understand, like which networks are safe to communicate on. I had a friend ask me recently that because EndoChat was taken down or cracked, and he said, you know, does that mean Telegram's not safe? Does that mean Tor is not safe? So I think a lot of people have a lot of misconceptions about what is safe. Can someone maybe comment on that? Maybe not.
No, there's a great, I mean, I'll tell you a great story. James Mickens at Harvard has this wonderful talk about security. And he said, basically, there's two kinds of enemies. There's the Mossad and there's everyone else. The Mossad wants you dead, you're kind of dead. And I don't actually think that's true. I mean, obviously, there's lots of people Mossad wants dead that's not dead. But I do think it's important to remember, like, when you're fighting for your freedom, in whatever form that takes, that you will have adversaries, and those adversaries will have some certain capabilities. For example, they may be able to, you know, monitor whole internet cables. They may be able to do even satellite monitoring. They may be able to do interception or cell phone downgrade attacks. Interceptions of all your voice messages are still possible. And I do think, you know, what we need to deliver as the Web3 community, which we are getting a lot better at since 2011, but we're still not quite there, is to really deliver the decentralized and encrypted technologies. I'm not as worried as Vinay about post-quantum, but I do think it's a reasonable thing to think about. But we need to deliver these technologies in a usable way that we can deal with both censorship, internet shutdowns, and mass surveillance. And I believe, and I think this is maybe where you know, there's a lot of controversy. I believe that honestly, we should give these technologies to everyone. And I take the kind of Pascal's wager, let's say, that humans and grassroots mobilizations will be the ones that eventually use these technologies for good, for self-sovereignty, for improving democracy, for improving the human condition in the long run. In the short run, yeah, there's going to be all sorts of terrible things, but we're going to get those terrible things regardless or not of technology. So I think our job is to provide the technology and get it to the hands of the people, and then the people can hopefully use it for good. And we can put as many safeguards as possible into those technologies, but we should not put in an off switch. I believe that very firmly, no matter who is using it.
Right, that's brilliant. We're running out of time, but I'd like to give each of you a final minute, and we'll start with Jorge first, to talk about sort of, you know, what are the worst problems we're facing here, and what would be the consequences if we do nothing?
Well, the consequence if we do nothing is that nothing happens. And what does that mean? It means that we keep being under the public eye and the private eye. And basically, as Vinay and Harry already said, you keep being out there, keep being exposed. And we need to understand that we need to provoke these changes and to bring these technologies to the people so that we can create I know Vinay said there's no such thing as normal, but create a somewhat new normal in which we do not try to bring internet only to connectivity only to the people that don't have access to the internet, but also change the way that those of us who do have access to the internet use it. And if we actually bring technologies like mesh networking to those that already have access to a data plan, but choose not to use it in specific situations, like in schools, when you're traveling abroad, when you're in a protest, even if you're in the middle of New York City where you have perfect connectivity, then we will have achieved that change that we need to make, that will allow us to preserve our human dignity, preserve the human condition, and also become better at how we share information.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I hope that happens. Let's go to Vinay now. I mean, what are we faced with if we don't act? Splinternets, inclusiveness, I mean, fragmentation along state lines, and how urgent is it?
So I think we're already in the worst possible case scenario, right? I mean, to all intents and purposes, the NSA regards the entire internet as a single giant eye, right? And I would be very surprised if there's any consumer device you can buy on the market that doesn't already come with convenient backup. So I probably one or more governments, right? I don't think it's credible that that is not true. There may be an exception for Apple because Apple's really stuck to their guns on this stuff. More likely, there isn't, right? So I think it's important that we think of this as being a game that we've already lost. And what we're attempting to do is to figure out how to claw back rights, right? Or even create new rights. Because it's the kind of benevolent assumption that everything is kind of okay now, but it might get worse in the future, that is blinding us to the fact that it's already worse, right? As Edward Snowden showed, it's already much worse. And we haven't really had the cultural shift that was needed after the Snowden revelations were made to tell people, right, you're starting from scratch. Right now, you have no privacy, you have no rights. And if you want to get some privacy and some rights, you're going to have to go out there and create those rights yourself, working together in teams, working together to create companies, projects, networks. But we have to, we have to understand that we're starting from the position where all of these rights have already been stripped, right? We're starting from nothing, not from things that are okay and they might get worse. We're starting from the Orwellian scenario. It's just the Orwellian scenario, but we pay for the devices, and mostly life is okay because they haven't really started rounding people up in earnest yet. But imagine what would have been made of those capabilities if you'd seen another 4 years of Trump presidency.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Harry, I'm going to give the last word to you. I mean, how near are we to getting there? How near are we to having these privacy technologies that we so desperately need and crave in many countries?
Well, I think, when I started in this field, there was these visions that everyone would use mesh nets to access the internet. There'd be community Wi-Fi everywhere. Instead, we got stuck with cable, ISPs, NSA snooping. We had visions that we could make a privacy-enhanced internet back in the early 90s. David Johnson working on this for ages, and we still aren't there yet. And I think the key has been honestly this, that up until very recently, there has been no funding for these projects. There has been no, and without funding, you're up against Google, you're up against the NSA, you're up against the Syrian government. It doesn't matter. You're not going to win if you need more than 2 or 3 guys and a few dollars. You need years of focused concentration. You need to do that concentration, and do that work before the next crisis hits. You can't program or change apps in the middle of the internet shutdown crisis. It's too hard. So I think where Seven and Orchid really had a good vision, and I think I'm hoping other people agree, is that now, thanks to cryptocurrency, thanks to people with Bitcoin, we're finally at a point where we can actually fund and create these technologies and make them usable. And this could be a once in a lifetime moment in terms of computing history and thus human history.
Absolutely. And I'm sure we're all really looking forward to hearing about what Edward Snowden has to say about all this. And he's on very, very quickly, well, in a few minutes. So at this point, I want to thank you all very much, Harry, Vinay, Jorge. And I don't want to keep you any more from the very important work that you're doing, because we've heard, how little funding there is and how important it is. So at this point, thank you very much, and sending it back to the host.
Thank you so much, Adriana, for passing the baton back. That was a super interesting session there. I have to echo, obviously, Harry's comments about Orchid and what we're doing here. And to that extent, I'm so glad that I have Gustav Simonson, one of Orchid's co-founders. Gustav, thanks for joining us today.
Hey.
Great. I don't think we actually didn't get much of a chance to hear, unfortunately, what happened on that previous session there. But obviously, they were talking about building your own network, mesh networks, and identifying privacy there. You actually retweet a lot of others who are talking about Ethereum, Avalanche, Bitcoin, Ethereum Layer 2 solutions. What are you most interested right now when it comes to blockchain technology?
Yeah, I spent some time looking at different alternatives to Ethereum, and there's some very exciting things going on now in the market. We have a lot of new networks recently launched that can kind of help offload traffic from Ethereum, and I think you mentioned the layer 2 solutions as well. Yeah, I think Avalanche is really exciting. Solana as well. There's many others, and I'm spending just some time kind of trying to keep track of what's going on in that market.
Cool. All right. Pardon me. If you can share, what are you working on right now? I saw that your most recent GitHub commits were for a game called Argo Navis. If it's not that, what are you spending the majority of your time on right now?
Oh, I'm actually just spending most time just keeping kind of just trying to catch up what's happening in the crypto industry, and things are moving so fast now in the bull market. So spend most of my time kind of reading various news, things on Reddit, Twitter. The Argon Navis is a kind of idea for like a deterministic blockchain-based game. That was a bit of a kind of fun break during the last bear market. And things got a bit slow. But yeah, now I spend most of my time kind of looking into DeFi and various kind of layer one networks.
Cool. Maybe more on that point, like you mentioned Avalanche specifically. I've done a little bit of research into Avalanche. Obviously, they've got a bridge that I think is already ready called Ethereum. What do you find interesting about Avalanche?
It's interesting in that they seem to figure out a consensus protocol where you can avoid a lot of the transaction ordering issues on Ethereum with minor extractable value, and they also have a probabilistic protocol for data availability in terms of the chain state. There's some similarities there between Avalanche and Solana, and some also Ethereum layer 2 solutions. And so I think we're seeing a lot of those efforts kind of go towards the same direction.
Cool, terrific. What do you, we've got a couple days of programming here. Cindy Khan, Ed Snowden, and Seven are coming back on in a moment here. What are you most looking forward to from the rest of Priv8?
Oh, just listening in and seeing where the space is heading. There's tons of interesting things already, and I'm just writing notes about pretty much everything. So, yeah.
Sounds good. All right, Gustav, thanks so much for your time. I know everybody's really busy these days, despite many of us being in lockdown or semi-lockdown, but I really appreciate you spending some time with us today. I now have the great privilege to pass things over to whistleblower and cybersecurity expert Ed Snowden, Dr. Stephen Waterhouse, and Cindy Khan.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks for joining us for this very special event right at the beginning of our conference. Pleased to introduce Cindy Khan from the EFF and, of course, Edward Snowden. Looking forward to hearing Ed speak for a little while, and then we'll be switching into Q&A. And Cindy, do you want a quick introduction also?
Sure. I mean, it's really hard to think about how to introduce Ed Snowden. I, of course, like to think of him as the person who gave me evidence to prove what I have been suing to stop for a very long time. But that's pretty personal. I think that, Ed really opened the eyes of the whole world to the links to which the, national security argument had been used to really drive a huge hole through our privacy and security. And I think we all should be indebted to him. But he also thinks big, and he thinks
because we had pseudonyms, because things were so free and so open. As he said, there was just a chance to just go out there and try new things with little or no consequence. And if there was a consequence, it was typically incredibly temporary because you could change your pseudonym and just move on if you really needed to. Whereas these days, I think you can still find those venues where you can explore and experiment and respect your ability to use a pseudonym, like Reddit to a certain extent. But increasingly, we have seen corporations try to corral users into using centralized platforms. That's one of the reasons why I got into the blockchain space, was because I saw this as a chance to take back some of that control and be part of a re-decentralization of the web, if it was ever truly decentralized in the first place, but really move it in that direction and play my part. So I think this is a really great chance to let you all know that through a decentralized project called Proof of Attendance Protocol, we are awarding NFT badges that will let you show that you were here live with Orchid and thousands of others watching Priv8. To claim it, it's not too difficult. I just need you to go to orchid.com/privatepoap, Priv8 POAP, and just fill out a quick form. I have to email you, or somebody's going to email you a customized link to claim the NFT. It was designed by Orchid's own Chad Soren Harper. You see it up on the screen here. We're really, really happy with it, and you'll be able to take it wherever you go. You do have to mint it. You can mint it on the XDAI blockchain for free, so you don't have to worry about Ethereum gas costs or transaction fee there. And you will see that option when you get your customized link, which I or someone else from the team will send you. And you just choose that XDAI option. You don't have to worry about gas. We're not going to keep your data. This Airtable where we're going to collect this information, we're not going to export the data. We're going to delete the Airtable base immediately after Priv8. That we're not going to sign you up for the newsletter or anything like that. So thanks so much to the POAP team for collaborating with us on this Priv8 badge. It was great having a phone call with Patricio Warthalter a few weeks ago about it. And that's that. So yeah, hit up orchid.com/privatepoap, fill out the Airtable, just need an email address. We'll delete the data right after, and but we'll get you your link to claim the POAP NFT first. So that being said, let's hand things over to Jeff John Roberts and the panel for Innovator's Dilemma, Post-Pandemic Privacy Policy.
Thanks so much for the intro, Derek. Welcome everyone to Post-Pandemic Privacy Policy. Obviously, going after Ed Snowden is a pretty daunting thing to do, but we've got some riveting guests of our own. I'm going to let our panelists introduce themselves, starting with Brian, followed by Anne and Kevin. Please give the audience a quick overview of who you are.
Hi, it's really great to be here and amazing to follow that panel too. I'm Brian Behlendorf. I'm General Manager for Blockchain, Healthcare, and Identity Initiatives at the Linux Foundation, and I've been immersed in kind of the open source space for the last 25 years and thinking about quite a bit about privacy all that time. Been on the EFF board since 2013 and the Mozilla board since 2003.
Yeah, hi, I'm Ann Fauvre. I'm the COO at Oasis Labs. Oasis Labs is the one of the earliest contributors to the Oasis network, a private and scalable layer 1 blockchain network. Prior to that, I worked at Apple. I was on the iPhone product management team and product marketing team, and really began to cut my chops on privacy in that role. I think focusing primarily on user privacy, and now very happy to be at Oasis, thinking about that in a decentralized way as well.
And I'm Kevin Werbach. I'm a professor of legal studies and business ethics at Wharton, the business school at the University of Pennsylvania. I work on various emerging technology issues, have been engaged in studying blockchain and crypto issues for a number of years. I wrote a book called The Blockchain and the New Architecture of Trust, looking at some of these issues. And way back in the beginning of my career, I was at the Federal Communications Commission in charge of internet policy back in the 90s. And that's when I met Brian, actually, the first time through. And glad that we didn't kill off that wonderful thing that the internet was becoming at that time. But we certainly have these issues that keep coming up, and it's fascinating to see how they're manifesting today.
Neat. Okay, well, thanks, everyone. Let's go right into it. And I'm going to open by saying I'm skeptical. I mean, I certainly think we have a privacy problem, and it's getting worse. And I love the idea of redesigning our sort of systems to facilitate it. However, to make changes, you can do two things. You can use law or tech, or ideally both. But I mean, I don't see anything out there that really can fix anything. You know, as a reporter, I'm constantly pitched on like blockchain identity solutions. But for that to work, you need the government, you know, to be a registrar. Governments are good at that, but they're bad at tech. And you need sort of cutting edge private tech, you know, which is the prerogative of companies, and they do that really well. But they don't have a great record on privacy, and nor do they have everyone's personal information. That's the government's job. So, you know, I don't know. I'll open with you, Brian. Make the case that tech can somehow fix our privacy problems.
Well, that's a tall order, and no one should claim that there's one tech that solves problems that are actually a mix of regulatory problems, of possible technologies out there, as well as societal norms to look at. But one thing that's given me quite a bit of hope over the last few years has been to see the emergence of a different approach to digital identity called self-sovereign identity. You could sometimes call it user-centric identity, but the idea is basically bringing to each individual the information that's interesting and important about them in a very local way, in something like a wallet where they hold verifiable credentials that describe, that attest to certain things about them issued by other parties, right? Rather than all of your interesting information sitting on the other end of a name and password at a portal somewhere. Instead, you might hold documents that are signed that attest to your diploma or other education status, that attest to a driver's license, that attest to perhaps even a birth certificate, that might attest to your ownership of certain real world things or your virtual things, quasi NFT like. And using a PKI infrastructure that, instead of being rooted and centralized, is distributed in some of the ways that we've learned can be distributed through public or permissioned blockchain systems. And there are now production systems running today that deploy these technologies. In fact, surprisingly, it's been a government that has been at one of the kind of leading examples of this, and that's been the government of British Columbia, which has deployed a system using this technology for business owners to hold their permits. As they interface with different levels of government, they share these permits in a way that apparently government agencies can't integrate their own backend systems well enough to do. But this self-sovereign identity approach is much more natively something that lines up with the GDPR and this idea of consent that's based in the sharing of information. It really puts the individual in a sense of ownership and control over those assets, not unlike the way that in cryptocurrencies, you know, not your keys, not your coins is kind of an essential concept. And so I think that comes to bear very much in this world of that we're facing today, with the potential for vaccination passports, or really verifiable credentials for communicating vaccination status. If we do that wrong, it ends up like cookies. It ends up like big centralized systems. It ends up with login with Facebook, login with Twitter. If we do it right, it looks very much like a world where you're sharing this signed attestation that you received a vaccine or otherwise have clear health status when necessary, but that can't be traced across systems the way that people would love to do today, or they would do with cookies or that sort of thing. So that's a place that we're spending a lot of time looking at in Linux Foundation Public Health, one of the communities I lead.
Yeah, and to be clear, I love the idea. I don't mean to, be pessimistic about everything, but I want to show everyone something. See this? I was lucky enough to get vaccinated. This is what I got. This is a piece of cardboard. Same technology as the 1950s. And while the British Columbia example is encouraging, I think for the big stuff like health data, like financial data, it's still the government is at the back end. And we really need governments to take a quantum leap forward, I think, before we can have sovereign identity that can plug and play with this stuff. Let's just turn to you, Anne. What are you seeing out there? Do you see sort of hope on this front?
Yeah, I guess I'd say so. I mean, I think as you've highlighted, both regulatory, bounds and guidelines are very important, and obviously having technological innovation is important as well. I think the other third factor here is demand from users and a need to have that. And I think what I would say is I do think we're seeing a real shift in this right now. And ultimately, I think governments and policies that governments enforce, as well as the technology and the way that what companies choose to invest in, are often tied to what they think users or their constituents will want or see as most important. And so one big shift I think that we've seen is a real demand from users. It's still, the minority, but it is a growing minority. And I think what we're seeing is, as a result, companies both in the consumer space and in the enterprise space really capitalizing on that. So we have a number of developers on our network now that have consumer-facing applications, and for them, from the very beginning phases of what they've built, they've really focused on being privacy first, and that's because that's what they're seeing their users want. So a great example is we work with a genomics company called Nebula, and their value proposition has really been to be an alternative to 23andMe that's privacy first. They use a number of encryption techniques as well as the confidentiality built into our network to store user data and ensure that users own their own genomic data. What that's done for them is it's allowed consumers to feel more confident actually getting whole genome tests as opposed to the smaller tests that they would get on 23andMe. So at the end of the day, the users are getting a better experience, they're getting a better product, and some additional ability to have confidence that data won't be shared or utilized in some way that they don't want to. They retain and own control of it. And I think that's just one example. We're seeing a lot of other privacy first companies come up really in response to what they're seeing their users and consumers as a whole want and ask for as well.
Well, Kevin, you literally wrote the book on blockchain. So, where are we between the, wonderful promise of what blockchain could offer and the practical realities of implementing it?
Somewhere in the middle, and we'll be somewhere in the middle for a long time. But the pandemic has had a real impact. And I talk about blockchain as a new architecture of trust. It's like the discussion we're having about privacy. It's not just fundamentally about we need a technology. There needs to be incentives, and people need to want to solve problems for which the technology is a good solution. And one of the things that's happened, the challenge with privacy has often been that people don't realize what they're giving up. So, I'm just using Facebook and I'm sharing information with my family and friends, and they're just targeting ads to me. So why do I care that much about privacy? And we've seen what happened. But with the pandemic, we've got issues like contact tracing, where it's involving very serious concerns about healthcare data that people can readily imagine how things could go wrong. So that's what you saw, for example, Google and Apple getting together and coming up with a framework for contact tracing that was privacy protective in terms of some of the cryptographic techniques it uses. Groups like Brian's that are working on similar sorts of things like vaccine passporting. And then we're also having debates. So Israel is leading the world in the speed of vaccination, in part because it has a fairly centralized healthcare system and promised certain clinical data to Pfizer. And so that's kicked off a debate, and it's not clear what the right answer is. But I think we are starting to see these issues now raising in their level of importance. And it is easy to badmouth governments and say governments can't do tech, but governments can do policy, governments can do agenda setting, governments can do convening, and governments can set challenges for the private sector. And we are starting to see more governments saying, okay, we get why this is important. And people saying we want something that will give us confidence and trust in using these systems. And frankly, given the environment we're in, there's such a huge gap in trust and a need to address it, that's starting to stimulate a combination of top-down initiatives with bottom-up activity.
I think it's really interesting what you said about companies like Apple and Google taking the lead in forging new kind of ways of anonymity and privacy going forward. And Apple, of course, it's become a core part of their brand identity. And part of me is like, that's fine. Apple seems good at this stuff. Let's let them run with it. But I mean, and you work there, do you see any drawbacks into simply let's just, see how far Apple can take this?
Yeah, I mean, I obviously can't speak for their intent now. What I will say is I think, they do care very deeply about consumer privacy. It's very clear in the way that they've built products and the decisions that they've made of what to focus on. That said, I think, there is some concern just in general that any company would be the one setting what really is a regulatory guideline around how privacy should be used. And so I think while I applaud Apple for the work that they've done to set these new privacy standards, what it indicates to me is a real lag by the federal government to set the right standards. I mean, ultimately, I worked in politics as well, and ultimately, the way I think you should see a regulatory body is to set some broader bounds or wall around what's possible for companies to operate. And what we're basically not seeing regulators do that now. We're seeing some state level regulation passing, but it's very much being, it's fragmented. It's somewhat manipulated by some strong viewpoints of certain companies. And so I think particularly in the US, there's really a need right now to set some broad national standard for what consumer privacy looks like, and to really take privacy advocates' views into perspective when they do that as well.
Yeah, Brian, you've worked with Microsoft, I believe, and other sort of big companies. How do we harness this sort of new impetus to, seeing these companies care about privacy and channel it in the most constructive ways? And do you see any sort of danger in, Apple deciding it's going to be at the forefront of privacy?
Yeah, well, the Linux Foundation as a whole obviously works with every major technology company. I mean, even like the vast majority of the Fortune 500. But also, it's important to us that when we design these, how our projects work, that they're open to companies of any sizes, that they're open to individual developers contributing and that sort of thing. And it really comes from that Louis Brandeis quote about sunlight being the best disinfectant, right? If you're running your technical software development processes or standards and specification processes, or others as public-facing types of initiatives, the odds of scurrilous behavior happening are a whole lot less, right? The ability to hide, APIs that might create advantage for one company or another are much more, it's much harder to hide that kind of stuff, right? And so that's where, in everything we've done, and this is true at Hyperledger, the blockchain project we run, where we've got a lot of big companies working together on, distributed ledger kind of platforms for all sorts of use cases, including identity, or Linux Foundation Public Health, where it's really bringing together the public health authorities along with large and small companies and others who are meeting their needs as vendors, but also working together on common software just to move further and faster and help provide that kind of visibility into how you're using those APIs. All of that says that I think working together in the public and having it a bend towards thinking about the long term. How do we repeat or avoid repeating the cookie debacle of the early '90s as the HTTP standards body? Which I have to play like a culpable kind of like do a mea culpa on a little bit. Build something that we thought was just about maintaining state in the HTTP session in the protocol, but instead turned into this fabulous way to implement third-party tracking and all the surveillance dystopia we see. We have to be thinking long term about the technologies that are built and how to address the concerns that are about getting stuff out there so that society can reopen in the short term, but also using this as the basis for a lot of new uses we can't even conceive of today. How do we future-proof this in a way and avoid making some of those mistakes? There is no right answer. There's nothing that guarantees it. You can't totally rely on best efforts or good intentions, but you can, I think, hang your hat on if the processes around development are public and the software that's used to build it is open source and reusable, that at least gets you a head start on being able to keep that from letting you down dark paths. The final thing I'll add is you have to hang your hat on things like Ann Cavoukian's privacy by design. You have to look at how people are looking at designing these things in 2021. And I personally think hanging it around the individual and giving the individual agency in a world that has robbed them of that in so many different ways is the best forward-looking path for this. And I think self-sovereign identity does that. I think open source software does that in a big way too.
Yeah, no, I agree. However, we still, I think, pretty clearly are going to need governments. A couple of you mentioned, policy and regulators. They're not going to go away, and the only ones who are big enough who touches everyone to implement it. However, not to be a cynical reporter again, what I see in Europe is the GDPR regime seems to create this massive bureaucracy. It's been a feast for lawyers, and all it is a bunch of click cookies, accept, while also seeming to stifle Europe's innovation. No offense to Europeans out there. But meanwhile, in America, Congress just cannot seem to get it together to pass something. But I do want to shift to a more hopeful task here. Where are the forums where people are getting it right? What's the most sort of promising, regulatory forum that gets you excited and it's going to give me some hope? Anyone can take that.
Well, yeah, I'll jump in. I wouldn't write off the United States. I think there was a lot of good that came out of GDPR and the large enterprise that Europe has engaged in privacy. Although I would agree with you that there are lots of problems with it, and in some ways it's entrenched the big players because they're the ones who are able to comply. People in the United States have watched that, and for too long we haven't had comprehensive privacy legislation in the US. There's bipartisan agreement that it needs to happen, and when you actually look at where the disagreements are, they're actually pretty narrow. And I think the impetus is quite strong, and there's quite strong impetus to say, okay, what do we learn from what Europe did, but not necessarily just copy it, try and do something that's better. So I would actually be somewhat optimistic about that, as well as some of the experimentation and innovation that's coming from the states in the US. California was the first, but there are a number of others that are looking at creative ways to address this problem through experimentation. The other thing to think about is, I mentioned the debate about the vaccine tracing. We are seeing these issues become really central, and not necessarily in traditional areas. So what's going on now with central bank digital currencies is China is trying to basically be the future of money, which is with its DCEP project, and doing some interesting creative things around anonymity for transactions among the private parties. But no one has confidence that China will be privacy protective in terms of the government getting access to data when it wants it. The United States, Europe, liberal democracies are looking at that and saying, okay, we need to move forward with some kind of next generation digital money, potentially using blockchain or blockchain-like foundations. And we need to do it in a way that's true to our values, that is not just an opportunity for massive unconstrained surveillance. There's also concern about privately what Facebook is instigating with its DM project. So I think that's going to actually create some pressure from the financial world for government to be more aggressive, in particular in this administration in the US, to again, bring the industry parties and the experts together and say, how do we do this in a way that addresses privacy in a way that we care about?
Yeah, I think that's fair. I guess the one pushback I'd say is like, and I don't think you disagree with this, but regulation alone obviously won't solve this, right? And I think, as you mentioned, Jeff John, I think the fact that GDPR has led to such a large bureaucracy is perhaps an example of that. I think we will need to see a continued shift in consumer thinking. None of these things are siloed or separate from each other, but I think the more we see challenges like some of the privacy issues that have come up in the U.S., I think many of them that have been raised around COVID data tracking, all of the things that I think have made it more clear to a normal consumer some of the issues that are occurring. But I think you really do need to see, money talks. The way people spend their money, the way they use products, ultimately will speak to this. So if people again are continuing to pick products that are privacy first over those that are not, that will be a sign to companies. And I think, frankly, if we just look at this from a marketing perspective, I think we're already seeing a shift in that. Apple's not the only company talking about privacy. All of the big tech companies now are investing a lot of money and resources into explaining how they also have privacy built into their solutions. So I think that's good for us, but I think we'll need to continue to see users really pushing this forward for us to see real innovative change, as opposed to just some regulation that creates loopholes alone.
Yeah, if I could say there, government doesn't just regulate though. So, what if, government catalyzed the foundation of the internet with what DARPA did back in the 1960s? What if there were a $1 billion, a $10 billion moonshot on privacy?
Yeah,
funded by government. Again, a lot of the technology is there, but there are lots of different ways that government can play a role other than just saying you've got to do this to comply.
And also, government is a big user of the technology. So that card that Kevin held up, right, it was issued to him by a government authority. And if he has to use that to cross into another country, both countries, at that border are going to use that card as well, right, to check that happens. And this is a really hot issue now when the current live debate around the data format for how those verifiable credentials should work is, should that verifiable credential contain Kevin's full name, his social security number, perhaps if it's the result of a test that's done, a COVID test might include other extraneous, medical information like blood type. None of that is stuff that somebody, if he were to try to use that to get into, to go see the Rolling Stones or something, that a bouncer at that gate should have any information of, should simply say, here's this individual presenting a valid cert. I shouldn't even have to save their name, right? I shouldn't even have to remember anything about it. All I should see is a green checkbox on my app to let Kevin in. So the hot debate is how much that data format contains PII or is stripped of that and contains things that are unique to Kevin, allow that person to validate Kevin can come in, but otherwise can't be correlated to the data that I could go buy off of big databases and build this rich profile of Kevin and the fact that he went and saw the Rolling Stones, right? This is a very hot and real thing. And if we're going to avoid the scenario we fell into with cookies and other trackable technologies on the internet, we actually need the government health authorities and the others who are setting how the government uses these technologies to buy into something that might be a stretch beyond what their instinct would tell them, which is, I want to know everything, I want to know everything about anybody, and I want to store that in a big data lake because that's what my vendors are selling me. So this is where I think having government play an active role and understand these issues and be a peer in these processes to others is really super important.
Yeah, I just love that idea because I used to live in New York and bars had taken to scanning my driver's license to go in to buy a drink. And, think of the information they got, and it's just absolutely ludicrous. All they need to know is how old I was. But anyways, we have about a minute left, and I want to do a quick sort of not a lightning round, but I love what you said, Anne, about products coming on the market. So I'd like all three of you to quickly tell me one or two of your favorite privacy products you've encountered recently. Why don't you start, Anne?
Yeah, I'm a big fan of the Brave browser. I think that's it's been really cool to see what they've done on their end. And obviously, as a former Apple employee, always a big fan of what Apple's doing on the privacy front.
My favorite example is Kiva is working with the government of Sierra Leone to do a national digital identity system based on self-sovereign ID as a path to doing privacy-preserving credit bureau and credit records for people as an alternative to the Equifax kind of situation we have in the States.
Very cool. Brave, Kiva, and Kevin, what's your pick?
Yeah, and I'm going to say actually that, not that I'm using it or entirely endorse it, but look at what China's doing with controllable anonymity, because I think they're ahead of the rest of the world in terms of thinking through the different dimensions of how you address privacy and the policy issues around it.
Okay, my goodness, that was a Chinese product that I did not expect, but I will think about it. Anyways, it's been a great panel. Thanks, a whole bunch of new ideas there. I learned a lot. I hope you did too. This was post-pandemic privacy policy. So thank you, everyone. And I will kick it back to our host.
Wow. I don't really know what else to say. Although I will say that I loved what Anne had to say about Nebula, using Oasis Labs platform to offer a privacy-focused competitor to 23andMe. That was really, really cool to hear about. Kevin talking about how other jurisdictions are learning from Europe's foray into privacy protecting legislation like GDPR. Brian talking about how verifiable credentials work and how much data that format should contain. I've done some work in that space. I worked with an organization for quite a while who's working on verifiable credentials and decentralized identities. So great to hear that again. And Jeff John talking about how the government of British Columbia is already working with this technology and more, just brought me right back around, really back into my first foray with blockchain blockchain technology back in late 2017. On that last point Jeff John made about driver's licenses are being scanned by bouncers at the bar, I remember the first time I ever saw that happen, and I thought it was really weird at the time. And then of course I thought, well, yeah, it's going to show that data and whether it's true. And then, later when I got into this space and started thinking about decentralized identities and verifiable credentials, I really started to think like, oh my God, this is potentially incredibly invasive technology that could be heavily abused depending on what data that scanner actually pulled out, how much it showed the bouncer, how much data actually gets stored on that device after the fact, the privacy policy for that data, and things like that. So definitely something to keep in mind. I'm not going to throw any accusations out at anybody, but certainly when you have technology like that, as we've heard before and time and again, it has the potential to do good. It has a potential to do a whole lot of harm. So just something to keep in mind when you're buying stuff and when somebody's asking for your identity or something similar, personally identifiable information for whatever reason. With that said, as I mentioned earlier, I wanted to bring this back up again. We're awarding NFT badges through proof of attendance protocol that will let you show that you were here live with Orchid and thousands of other people. And to claim it, all you need to do is go to orchid.com/PRIV8 POAP. That stands for proof of attendance protocol. You'll get redirected to an Airtable, ask for your email address, how you're feeling about private so far, and send. As I mentioned earlier, we're going to delete the data. We just want to be able to send you a custom link just for you to one of the so that you can claim this NFT badge through POAP. And that's it. That's the end of it. By the end of this week, we'll have completely deleted that data. The Airtable base will be removed. No export. So we very much want to protect your data. For better or worse, this was the only way we could help you claim that private badge. Again, thanks so much to the POAP team for collaborating with us. Tomorrow, we're actually going to have Chad Soren Harper, the designer of this and so many other beautiful pieces on Orchid's website and other assets, have him live here with us for a really special NFT. We're not taking any money from it, but I think Chad's really proud of this, and the rest of us are really proud of it as well. So yeah, Chad will be joining us tomorrow. I want to give a quick shout out to our community, whether you're on Telegram, Discord, you follow us on Twitter, or elsewhere on Reddit. Big shout out to the OXT troopers. We love you guys. Thanks so much for being with us through this journey over the past few years. And we're really looking forward to what the rest of 2021 has to offer. With that, I know we're running a little over time, so I'm going to pass things off to Seven a little early for a conversation with Jeffrey Paul.
All right. Thanks, Derek. Thanks for the previous session. Hey, what's up, Sneak? How are you?
I'm well. How are you?
I'm good. So Sneak and I actually go kind of way back to my earliest days in cryptocurrency. When I was, I just joined up with Pantera back in the I think it was November 2013, and a mutual friend of ours, when I asked him, hey, I need some help with storing Bitcoins, because I guess we're kind of buying a bunch. And he said, oh, you got to talk to this guy. And so I had a video call with Sneak, and within 24 hours, he had left where he was and was in San Francisco with me. And over the course of the next year or two, we built some very interesting technologies around storing Bitcoin securely, and really kind of very innovative early techniques around cold storage. We're both also involved in like one of the earliest integrations of multi-sig in an exchange with Bitstamp and BitGo. We've remained friends ever since, and he's one of the deepest thinkers and practitioners that I know in actually practicing privacy himself. So Sneak, just want a quick intro perhaps. You want to tell everyone what you do and who you are a bit?
Certainly. So I'm Sneak, sometimes known as Jeffrey Paul, usually Sneak. I founded a company called EEQJ, and I'm the co-founder of a key storage company called Keyternal. I'm a hacker. I write on my blog. I research privacy and security technologies. I start companies sometimes. My main company, EEQJ, I started a dozen years ago, and most of the work that I end up doing just as a result of this world we found ourselves in is cryptography related, Bitcoin, blockchains, communications, messaging, privacy, operational security. And that's really the focus of my life as far back as I can remember. I don't really set out to do research. I just use the tools that are in front of me, and things sort of fall out of them. And that's how I got involved in cryptocurrencies. That's how I got involved in secure communications and privacy tools. I've been doing this for a really long time, and pretty much everything I touch, I find something about it that I want to tell people about and teach people about that is not obvious when you use a tool or look at it. And oftentimes the things that I learn about the things that I touch are at odds with common beliefs or even the messaging from the companies about those products. One of the things that happened to me recently was I was using the new new Apple Silicon Macs and the Apple's messaging around their platforms and their devices is such that, like, Apple cares about your privacy and wants to protect it. And there's a kernel of truth in that. But like all good memes, it's mostly false.
Yeah, I think there's a billboard in Berlin, just near the Alexanderplatz, which has a huge picture of an iPhone, which is like basically in German, "Apple is privacy." I think that's they definitely message around that.
You have to differentiate somehow, right? But Apple wants you to be private from the other surveillance companies that dominate this marketplace, which we heard someone talk about before. The problem is that all of these companies are subject to United States law, and the United States, thanks to Snowden, we now know is not really a trustworthy adversary across the network. They will take your data without cause or due process or anything like that, and they'll keep it for all time. And so all of the companies that are forced to participate in this program, any information they have is not private from US military intelligence. For example, in 2019, Apple compromised the private data of 30,000 of their customers without a warrant, without any sort of judicial proper due process, and they admit this in their own transparency report under the FISA section. And so, if I think it's pretty not normal thing to like want to trust Apple, want to believe that what they're saying is true, and in a lot of ways they will protect your data. However, they can't protect your data against the biggest threat of all, which is the United States, which Snowden showed us, is no longer a country that has due process or what can traditionally be thought of as the rule of law. We don't have immunity from ubiquitous spying, and these companies will turn your data over. They have to turn your data over. It's really not up to them. And so all the data that they collect ends up being data that is available to the state on demand at any time.
So you wrote about this, and the article was called "Your Computer Isn't Yours." I'm actually going to tweet this out, but if anyone just looks in the search engine and look up Jeffrey Paul and "Your Computer Isn't Yours," and you wrote it in November 2020. Tell us a bit about, first of all, like what's happening, and also then as a sort of segue into how you actually practice this in your life, because you're one of the few people I know who talks this stuff up, but then also actually does something about it themselves and lives your life, and without sort of telling everyone all your secrets, because obviously that's partly operational security practices and how you do things as revealing that as kind of becoming an issue, but just give people have some tips of what they can do to avoid some of the things that you and others are highlighting.
Certainly. So I wrote this in my blog, which is Sneak.Berlin, and I write other stuff like that. But this one in particular seemed to get a lot of traction, and several million people read it very quickly. And it illustrated the point that the Mac computers, and also every iPhone, every iPad does this as well. They transmit over the network information about the applications you launch. This is done in this instance as an anti-malware technique, but also every iPad, every iPhone constantly communicates with Apple, exposing your city level location via geo IP based on the hardware serial number, which is something you can never change. It's not like a cookie you can clear. Apple has effectively logs of every app that is opened, and the developer of every app, which usually means just every app, because most developers have.
So the kind of good reason for doing this is to figure out malware and make sure that the applications are sort of cleared right by them as far as good applications you should be running.
That's true, but there's some other services they provide that even if you opt out of every other thing on a Mac, the device is still maintaining persistent connection to Apple based on serial number, even if you don't launch a single app. Apple wants to promote this perception of privacy, but ultimately, Apple, for example, shipped iMessage with the iPhone years ago, and it's end-to-end encrypted, and it's great. But then they backdoored it by introducing iCloud Backup, which is not end-to-end encrypted and backs up all your iMessages or your iMessage keys to Apple with Apple keys, so they can decrypt everything constantly. This didn't stop them from playing up the whole Apple versus the FBI thing with the San Bernardino shooter's iPhone. But in reality, Apple had already turned over all of the data from that phone to the state. They didn't need to break into that phone because Apple has access to the data at all times and turned it over. So Apple actually had a plan to fix this end-to-end encrypted the backdoor in their end-to-end messaging encryption, and they scrapped it because the FBI asked them to stop. And they said, well, this will make it harder for us. And Apple said, okay, well, we won't implement this thing that we already planned out, structured, implemented, because we will preserve access to the backdoor in this end-to-end encryption for you. So it's very important to remember that Apple is only concerned about your privacy from their competitors in the marketplace. They're not concerned about your actual personal privacy, your location privacy, things like that, or they wouldn't build the systems that they do. So to that end, there are a number of steps one can take if you're technically inclined to preserve your privacy along these lines. Unfortunately, they're not built into these tools. They're harder to use. In some cases, you actually have to use separate hardware. One of the things that I wrote about recently was the fact that the new Apple OS, which is the only OS that runs on the new Apple Silicon Macs, initially, they fixed this, kudos to them, but initially it wouldn't let you use a VPN for the Apple apps. They would always bypass the VPN and talk directly to Apple, which leaks your location. And one of the very simple things that people can do, which ties this very nicely back to Orchid, is use a VPN. And if you have the time and inclination, use a VPN for all of your traffic, put it on a dedicated hardware device, put it upstream of your computers and phones and everything. For example, we were speaking yesterday, I told you that my iPhone, my last iPhone, I might add, my iPhone doesn't have a SIM card in it. It can still be used for emergency calls. It can still talk to a tower, but it doesn't speak itself to the network. I carry with me a router that VPNs all my traffic, and so the vendors of apps and other services that it talks to, because it's very difficult to live without apps. You can't go full offline. That would compromise your own effectiveness. But the services and apps that it talks to, and Apple especially, my IP doesn't change when I go from place to place. When I come home and leave my house, normally Apple and every other app that's running in the background on your phone, the service providers of those things know. They know when you're home. They know when you get home. They know when you leave home. They know when you switch to your mobile carrier. They know when you get on a plane and go to another city. They know when you arrive at the office. They have all this pattern of life data. Additionally, anyone watching the network, which is the military intelligence services in America and other countries, have access to all this information as well. And so there are some steps you can take, for example, like using hardware VPN devices and things like that, but they're quite inconvenient. And I think a lot about and I plan a lot for the ways that we can, as a society, improve the tools around privacy. Because if we don't, then we will hit this, what was discussed previously, this point of no return, where we won't get the ability to make meaningful choices in our lives to regain any of this. Right now, there's a couple small things we can do. Like using Facebook isn't mandatory. Using Instagram and using these surveillance networks and censorship networks, Twitter, Discord, Telegram, none of these are end-to-end encrypted. None of these are private. All of these are subject to massive censorship and surveillance. And by using them, we make the world worse. And right now, we can get away with not using them. Some people will claim like, oh, I have to use Facebook for my business. That's bullshit. It's not true. But they make life easier in some ways, but also in the macro across our whole society, they make our society much, much worse. And every single person that uses them makes them more attractive to other people to use them. And the more people that use them, the worse our society becomes. So one of the small things that we can do there is use VPNs, reject services that aren't end-to-end encrypted or explicit that are known to be privacy hazards. Seek out smaller communities that are run by that are self-run. I'm not talking about like Facebook groups. I'm talking about like actual websites run by people not apps, run by people that are part of that community. Centralization is not inherently bad, but over-centralization is. And if you have a centralized community run by that community that is censored, you can always go to a smaller one that's run by another small community. Whereas if you have, these giant society-wide centralized and censored and non-private data mined services, then you can't. Eventually, you get to a point where there's just critical mass and you can't opt out anymore. This has happened in a lot of countries in Europe using WhatsApp, for example. You can't get along in those societies unless you have a WhatsApp account. You submit to Facebook censorship and surveillance. And I don't want that to happen everywhere. And so the best things we can do to those ends are use smaller services and end-to-end encrypted tools that can't be censored selectively, that aren't subject to primary content surveillance, and participate in smaller communities and smaller organizations. One of the common things that I hear from people today is that the internet has gotten terrible, or what people talk about as being the internet has gotten terrible. And all the people that made the internet really cool way back when we first got involved in it, we're still here, we're still using it, but we've all been kind of overshadowed by this corporate internet of apps and censorship and control, where you can't really post what you're thinking because it becomes part of your permanent record. You can't really use anything but your government issued state identity. And what we really need to do is participate in things that aren't like that and build things that aren't like that. There's a lot out there, and there's more every day, and we can start them ourselves. We can give our time and attention and content and minutes of our day to people that are doing, to groups and people that are doing things like that. And we can opt out. Right now, we still can opt out. We really need to. So that's kind of how I try to live my life. I don't provide my identity or personal information to anyone that doesn't have a strict need for it. I've opted out of all of these primary censorship platforms because I would like to be able to communicate with the people that want to hear what I have to say without some third party saying, "Oh, they're not allowed to read that." That's, to me, I think that's an existential threat to our society, to our free society, to any sort of small L liberal values that have come about in the last few hundred years. If there's sometimes on, sometimes off censorship, and you can't say anything that isn't tied to your permanent record, your official government name, then you don't really have the ability to change things in society. And we need that. We have to preserve that. So and it requires personal sacrifice. You have to turn away from these platforms that all your friends are using because it's making the world worse.
Thanks, Sneak. That's actually good advice and also very sobering. And I'm going to go delete some social media accounts right now. I wanted to ask you a question about. I think we're kind of running out of time, but can you briefly talk about what you did to Bitcoin back in the day and how it kind of led to Ethereum, perhaps?
So one of the things that I do whenever I find new technology, I'm a hacker, and regardless of what you think you've heard, that means a number of different things in different contexts. It predates computers by a long time. And the core of it, to summarize decades of culture in a short time, is that I try to use things in ways that nobody else thought of using them. For better or for worse, right? And the Bitcoin transactions actually have a programming language inside of them. Bitcoin was originally envisioned as a proto smart contract network. And there's a programming language that you can use to execute programs on this network. And way back when, I started poking at it and discovered that if you do things that you shouldn't, or rather that aren't expected of you, then what will happen is you can break the network. And this led to, I didn't report it at the time, there's an independent discovery, and this led to transaction format whitelisting, which is basically the only transaction that's very easy to get into the Bitcoin blockchain today is X sends Y to Z, right? And as a result, there isn't really much else that happens on Bitcoin without fitting into these very narrowly defined use cases. I don't know if that can be said to have led to Ethereum, but that's certainly one interpretation of that set of facts.
That's how I think about it. Anyway, thank you so much, Sneak. It's been a pleasure as always, and thank you, and look forward to talking to you soon.
Thank you,
Derek.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, guys. Hang on for just a second. I just want to say thank you so much, Sneak, for the conversation. I was so happy when I was able to get back into the Apple ecosystem this time last year. You're kind of making me regret it. I'm not sure the other options are that much better, but regardless, like I said earlier, always something to think about, and before you make any purchases. This ultimately. once again, like, let's keep this conversation going. Private, the stream for today is just about to come to an end, but let's keep this conversation going. Head to orchid.com, hit the footer. There's a multitude of options there for you to join the community. Yes, they are centralized solutions for better or worse, but hopefully as these decentralized solutions mature and pick up some more steam, we will do our part to help with that. We can actually move the entire conversation over there. In the meantime, we have Discord, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, a YouTube channel, which is this is being live streamed on right now, a Telegram group, and an announcement channel if you just want to get news. Regardless, there's an option that probably suits your needs. Please join. We have an amazing community that is about 15 or 20,000 strong, and we'd love for you to join. So if you get a chance and you are so inclined, visit orchid.com, find those links, and join us. In the meantime, tomorrow we have an amazing day coming up. Rohan Gray in conversation with Peter Van Valkenburg, moderated by Isabella Kaminska. I will be chatting with Jay Sorik Freeman here. And a bunch of other fantastic individuals like Audrey Tang and Misha Benoliel and others. So we very much look forward to you joining us on day 2 of Private. And for now, stay free.